The wind howled across the Wyoming Territory that night like a creature in pain, rattling the shutters of Thomas Carver's cabin and worrying the eaves as if to pry them loose. Snow drifted high against the log walls, piling into corners and burying the fence posts until the whole world seemed swallowed by white silence. Inside, the fire cracked in the stone hearth, a dim glow licking across the planks. Thomas sat in his rocking chair, its slow creak the only rhythm in the room besides the steady ticking of the brass clock on the mantel. He nursed a tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm, staring into the flames as though they might answer the questions he never spoke aloud. It was a night meant for solitude, the kind he had come to know well. Then came the knock. Not the polite tap of a neighbor nor the friendly thump of a ranch hand, but a pounding, urgent, uneven, desperate. It startled him so deeply that he spilled a dark splash of coffee onto the boards. For a moment he froze, every instinct wary. In this country, a man could not be too careful who he let across his threshold. The knock came again, more frantic. Thomas rose, hand brushing the butt of the rifle that leaned beside the door. He pulled the latch and swung it open, and the storm rushed in, snow biting at his face, wind clawing at his coat. There, framed by the dark maw of the night, stood a woman. Her shawl was torn and crusted with frost, hair braided but half frozen with ice. In her arms she clutched a child no more than 4, cheeks raw and red, while another, slightly older, clung to her skirts. Their breath came in ragged plumes, bodies trembling with cold. For an instant no one spoke. Only the roar of the wind and the hollow thudding of Thomas's heart filled the space. The woman's eyes met his, eyes wide and fierce, yet shadowed with despair. "Please," she said at last, voice hoarse as though scraped against stone. Suspicion warred with mercy in him. He had lived too long in these wild parts not to know the dangers of strangers. Yet something in her gaze, something raw and unguarded, cut through the armor he had worn for years. "Come in," he said gruffly, stepping aside. They entered in a flurry of snow and shivers. The children's boots left wet tracks across the boards as Thomas barred the door against the storm. He fetched blankets from the cot, wrapping them around thin shoulders, then set bread on the table along with the last of the smoked venison. The woman murmured her thanks, but her voice trembled, as if unused to gratitude. The children fell upon the food with quiet desperation, crumbs catching in their lashes as they chewed. Thomas poured coffee for the woman, though her hands shook so badly she spilled some onto the shawl. She drank anyway, eyes closing as though the bitter warmth might hold her together. He said little, only watching them from the rocker. The firelight painted their faces with gold and shadow, and for the first time in years the cabin did not feel entirely empty. The storm raged on outside, snow battering the shutters, but inside there was breath and warmth, the fragile pulse of life. The little one, half asleep beneath a wool blanket, curled against his mother's side. The older child leaned close to the flames, boots dripping steadily onto the hearthstones, and Thomas, staring into the fire once more, realized that for this night at least the silence he had carried so long was broken. Warmth had returned, if only for a fleeting hour. Morning came slow and gray, the storm spent but not forgotten. Snow lay heaped against the cabin door, pressing in like a white wall. The world outside was muffled, swallowed by drifts, yet inside the fire still smoldered, its glow holding back the chill. Thomas rose early as he always did, tending the embers until the flames licked high again. The woman stirred on the cot, her shawl pulled tight, her children curled beside her like pups clinging to warmth. She blinked at him, weary but alert, as though sleep had been shallow, broken by the kind of fears that never quite left a person's mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "My husband's gone." The words carried no sorrow, only a flat certainty. "And there are men who'd rather I stayed gone too." She said no more, turning her gaze to the flames. Thomas did not press. He had lived long enough to recognize the weight of stories better left in silence, at least for now. He only nodded, pouring her coffee, and the bitter steam curled between them. The children woke soon after, all restless energy. They padded about the cabin, running small fingers over the rough-hewn table. The carved handles of old tools hung neatly on the wall. Their curiosity was unchecked, as though hunger and fear had receded for the first time in months. The older boy reached for the rifle mounted above the mantel, his hand stopping just shy of the polished stock. "That one's not for play," Thomas said, his voice stern but not unkind. The boy withdrew, eyes wide, but Thomas saw the spark of respect in the child's glance. Sarah's eyes followed everything, their hands on the tools, their boots scuffing across the boards, their laughter beginning to rise in small bursts. Then her gaze fell upon a chest in the corner, its lid half ajar from years of disuse. Folded inside, draped in yellowed muslin, lay a wedding dress. The lace was stiff, age-touched, the fabric brittle from years of waiting. Her breath caught, and in her stillness Thomas knew she had seen it. She looked at him then, not with questions but with understanding. A woman recognizes certain silences in a man, the ones shaped by loss. She did not ask whose it had been, or why it lay untouched in a chest. She only looked away, hands tightening around her shawl. They shared breakfast at the rough table, cornbread, a little salt pork, coffee to wash it down. Words were few. It was the children's shy laughter that filled the silence, their small jokes tentative at first, then freer as the minutes passed. The sound seemed to lift the rafters, to loosen something in the air that had long been bound tight. For a fleeting hour, Thomas felt the cabin alive again. He caught himself listening not to the ticking clock, but to the scrape of spoons against tin plates, to the muffled giggle of the younger child when crumbs clung to his chin. Then, faint but sharp, came the sound of hoofbeats. They carried through the valley, distant but deliberate, echoing against the snow-packed ridges. Sarah froze, her cup trembling in her hand. Her children, sensing her fear, pressed close against her sides. Her shawl slipped from one shoulder, but she made no move to fix it, only clutched the little ones as though the walls themselves might break apart. Thomas stood slowly, gaze narrowing toward the shuttered window. He said nothing, but the sound of metal sliding was clear when he took the rifle down from its place above the mantel. The weapon, worn smooth by years of use, fit in his hands as naturally as breath. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer out. The valley stretched wide, blanketed in snow, silent save for the echo of hooves that soon faded into nothingness. Whoever had passed did not stop. Still, he kept the rifle ready until the silence had settled deep once more. Behind him, Sarah exhaled long and shaking. Thomas replaced the rifle, though his eyes lingered on her, reading what she had not spoken. Scars, invisible but sharp as any wound, lay across her spirit. He would not press her for their shape, not yet. In the hush that followed, the fire cracked, a child laughed nervously, and the cabin once more held its shadows. But there, within those shadows, a fragile thread of presence had been woven. Not trust, not yet, but something that mattered all the same. Dawn crept pale and cold across the valley, light spilling weakly through frost-veiled glass. The storm had broken, leaving the land hushed beneath a heavy quilt of snow. Branches bent under its weight, fences half buried, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, its embers glowing faint as if reluctant to let go of the night. Sarah was already awake. She stood near the door, her shawl pulled close, the children bundled in coats too thin for such a morning. Her movements were quiet, decisive, as though she had made up her mind in the still hours while the others slept. Thomas stirred from his chair, the creak of its runners carrying through the silence. "You'll leave in this?" His voice was rough, not from anger but from weariness at the thought. "I have to," Sarah said, her words soft but firm. "We cannot linger. The longer we stay, the more danger finds us." Her eyes flicked toward the children, then away, as if the truth of her fear might undo her if spoken plain. He rose without a word, moving to the shelves where he kept what little he could spare. From a sack he drew strips of dried venison wrapped in cloth. He fetched a canteen, its leather worn, and another shawl folded in the chest. Setting them on the table, he said, "Take these. The road is longer than you think." Pride flashed in her gaze, sharp and brief. "We'll manage." "You won't," Thomas answered simply. He had seen too many souls swallowed by winter, too many lives ended by the arrogance of going unprepared. For a moment she stood rigid, torn between refusal and need. Then her shoulders sagged, and with a small nod she gathered the provisions. She did not thank him aloud, but her lowered eyes spoke what words could not. At the threshold the children lingered. The younger one waved, mittened hand flapping awkwardly while the older stared at Thomas with something like admiration, though too shy to name it. Sarah guided them forward, her hand steady on their backs. She looked back only once. Her face, half shadowed by the shawl, held no clear expression, neither gratitude nor grief, only the guarded mask of a woman who had learned to trust no one too fully. Then she turned and the snow swallowed them. Thomas stood in the doorway long after their figures had blurred into the whiteness. The trail they left behind began filling at once, the storm's remnants erasing each step as though they had never come. He closed the door at last, the cabin groaning in its solitude. The fire hissed low. The rocking chair, when he sank into it, seemed louder than before, its creak echoing off walls that suddenly felt too wide, too empty. The shawl she had not taken still lay folded on the chest. The silence returned, deeper now. What warmth had flickered for a single night was gone, leaving only memory smoldering like coals that refused to die. The years did not rush so much as they crept, steady as the crawl of moss on stone. Seasons wheeled across the Wyoming sky, spring floods softening the earth, summers that burned the grass to brittle stalks, autumn winds that stripped the cottonwoods bare, and winters that sealed the land in white silence. Each turn of the wheel etched itself into Thomas Carver's body, weathering him as surely as rain hollowed stone. He worked as men do when there is nothing else but work to fill the hours. Fences fell and he raised them again, post by post, wire by wire. Cattle strayed or sickened and he tended to them alone, his hands hardened by rope and cold iron. The roof leaked, and he patched it with rough boards until the cabin looked more scar than house. Evenings he would sit in his rocking chair, its runners worn smooth, its groan as constant as the tick of the mantel clock. Yet in all his labors, echoes lingered. Sometimes while cleaning soot from the window, his rag would smear over the faint outline of a child's handprint, pressed there long ago in curiosity, yet still visible in the right light. He would pause, fingers resting over the small imprint, and the memory would open inside him like an old wound. The shawl remained too, draped over a chair by the hearth. She had left it behind in her haste, a thing both useless and sacred. He could not bring himself to fold it away nor to cast it out. It lived there like a quiet ghost, catching the firelight on nights when he sat staring too long into the flames. Time did not heal such things, it only deepened them. He told himself that the family he had sheltered for one night was gone, carried into some other life, perhaps into ruin, perhaps into peace. But the not knowing gnawed at him. Absence was a sharper blade than loss, for it cut without end. There were nights when storms rolled across the valley wild with thunder and rain, when the wind screamed against the shutters and the cabin shook in its bones. On those nights Thomas would sit upright in the rocker, heart thudding at every gust. For in the flicker of lightning he sometimes thought he saw shapes beyond the glass, shadows huddled against the storm, waiting for mercy. He would rise, open the door a crack, and find only the rain, only the emptiness of the land. The wind itself became a voice to him. He would close his eyes and hear it cry, thin and desperate, and remember the pounding on his door that winter night. He would remember her eyes, fierce yet pleading, and the children pressed close at her side. He would dream of their laughter, quick and bright as sparks, and wake with the ache of silence heavy in his chest. Other dreams came too. He would dream of her braids unbound, dark hair falling loose in firelight, though he had never seen them so. He would dream of her face unshadowed by fear, though memory never gave him such a gift. And always in the corner of his dreaming lay the wedding dress folded in the chest. White turned to yellow, lace stiffened with time, a relic of love buried before it could be spoken. He would dream of it swaying in a wind that never touched the waking world, as though mocking him with the promise of a life he had never taken. Loneliness, Thomas came to know, was not simply the absence of others. It was the presence of memory, constant and merciless. He had carried her absence longer than her presence, 6 years and counting, but it had shaped him more deeply than any season of drought or flood. His days were carved by the hollow where she had once been, as though the land itself remembered her passing. And still, he endured. The ranch, though smaller with each passing year, still bore his hand. The cattle lowed at dawn, and he answered. The fences leaned, and he set them right. The rocking chair creaked, and he sat in it night after night, listening to the sound as though it were his only companion. But in the deepest hours, When firelight died and shadows pressed close, he would imagine that knock again, sharp and sudden against the wood. He would rise every time, heart pounding. Yet when he opened the door, there was only night, only emptiness. The loneliness felt endless. The air carried the bite of autumn that night, sharp with the smell of dry grass and wood smoke. The cottonwoods along the creek had already turned, their leaves brittle and gold rustling like paper in the restless wind. Thomas Carver sat by the hearth, coaxing flame beneath the blackened coffee pot, the familiar gurgle rising as water met grounds. The cabin was dim but steady, lit only by the fire's glow and the steady tick of the brass clock on the mantel. He had long since made peace with nights like these, solitary, measured, unremarkable. Yet peace was a brittle thing. The knock came sudden. It rattled the wood as sharply as a rifle shot, firm and certain, carrying the exact cadence of a memory he had carried 6 years. His breath caught. For a moment he did not move, afraid the sound might vanish if he trusted it too quickly. The knock came again. He stood, every step toward the door heavy with disbelief. His hand found the latch, fingers trembling, and he pulled it open. Rain swept across the threshold, the storm having gathered in secret, wetting the air with a fine mist. And there, framed by that restless weather, stood Sarah, older, yes, and worn by years. Her hair carried more gray than he remembered, her braids thinner, face lined with shadows of roads too long and too cruel, but her eyes were the same, clear, unyielding, alive. Beside her stood the children, no longer small. The younger, once carried in her arms, now reached her shoulder. The older was nearly a man, his stance protective, though his eyes still held a spark Thomas recognized from that single night long ago. Their coats dripped rain, boots muddy, but their gazes burned with a brightness that pierced him. For a long while no one spoke. Only the rain filled the silence. Finally Sarah lowered her head, voice steady but frayed at the edges. "We've nowhere left to go. The years behind us have been full of loss, and danger has not finished following. I cannot run any farther." She lifted her chin then, meeting his gaze. "I will not beg. If you wish us gone, say it, and we will go." The fire cracked behind him. The smell of brewing coffee mingled with the wet air. Thomas felt the weight of the years press hard upon him. Years of silence, of waiting, of imagining this very moment and believing it could never come. He stepped aside without a word. Sarah ushered the children in. The cabin filled at once with motion and breath. The sound of boots scuffing against boards, coats rustling as they were shrugged off, rainwater dripping from hems to the floor. The smell of wet wool joined the sharper scent of smoke and coffee. It was as though the house itself drew a long breath after 6 years of holding it. The children stood awkwardly at first, eyes darting to the familiar walls, the mantel where the rifle still rested, the tools that had not moved, the shawl still draped over a chair. Recognition flickered between them, memories not lost, only buried. Sarah lingered near the hearth, warming her hands above the fire. She did not ask for food, though Thomas set bread and dried venison on the table. She did not ask for comfort, though her shoulders trembled with fatigue. She simply stood, letting the warmth soak back into her bones. Conversation was cautious, words few but weighted. She spoke of the years behind them, never in full detail but with enough to shape the outline. Towns fled in haste, nights spent in fear, losses too many to count. The children listened without flinching. They had lived each mile themselves. Thomas did not question more than she offered. Instead, he listened, nodding, and in the spaces between her words he heard what she could not yet say. That she had returned not only out of necessity, but because this cabin, this man, had never left her. The old tools on the wall seemed to watch, their handles catching the firelight like witnesses. The wedding dress in the chest, yellowed and folded, stirred in his thoughts like a ghost rising. Even the rocking chair groaned as though recognizing voices it had not heard in years. By the time the coffee was poured and the bread gone, silence no longer felt empty. It held weight, yes, but also a strange fullness, like soil long barren, touched at last by rain. Sarah's children sat near the hearth, boots steaming, their laughter tentative but real. Sarah herself met Thomas's gaze across the firelight. There was no plea in her eyes, no bargain struck, only a quiet question, waiting for his answer. And in that stillness, Thomas understood. What had once come and gone like a fleeting storm had returned, this time asking to stay. The days that followed unfolded not with sudden change, but with the slow turning of a wheel, long stuck in mud. At first, silence reigned. Sarah spoke little. Her children clung close, and Thomas carried on with his chores as though nothing had shifted. Yet something had shifted deep beneath the surface, like water moving under ice. The homestead, weary from years of solitude, began to stir beneath their hands. Sarah took to sweeping the dust from corners, scrubbing the windows until the autumn sun could pour through clear panes. She patched curtains, mended shirts, and stood by the stove, coaxing warmth from meals that Thomas had long reduced to little more than bread and meat. The children ran where once only cattle had moved, across the pasture, along the fence line, through weeds that had grown tall in neglect. Their laughter startled the air, scattering the silence that had ruled too long. Trust, like the land itself, needed time. Sarah's eyes often drifted toward the horizon, wary, listening for the echo of pursuit. The children startled at sudden sounds. But each day, fear lessened, worn down by the steady rhythm of chores, meals, and firelight. One evening, while Thomas worked a stubborn fence post into the earth, Sarah came to him, sleeves rolled, hands steady. Without a word, she took hold of the mallet and struck. They worked side by side until the post stood firm, their breaths clouding in the chill dusk. It was a small thing, but Thomas felt the earth itself acknowledge it, a partnership fragile yet real. Later still, she found the rifle scarred by years of use, its stock cracked. She set it in her lap and, with careful hands, began sanding, oiling, tending to it as though mending her own wounds. Thomas watched from the rocker, saying nothing, but his chest stirred with a quiet gratitude he could not name. In time, he too offered pieces of his story. One night, when the children slept, he drew out the chest and laid open the dress folded within. Yellowed lace caught the firelight, brittle with years. He told her of the bride who had never worn it, of the fever that claimed her before vows could be spoken. His voice was low, steady, but his eyes stayed on the fabric as though afraid to meet hers. Sarah listened, shawl drawn close, and for once her silence was not guarded, but reverent. At last she reached across, laying her hand atop his, scar meeting scar, grief meeting grief. Nothing more was said, nothing more needed saying. The homestead grew alive again. The rocking chair, long groaning in solitude, now carried the rhythm of evenings shared. Sarah mending cloth, Thomas carving wood, children whispering as they drowsed by the fire. The fence line stood straighter, the pasture cleared, the cattle fed. The cabin walls, once mute with emptiness, began to hum with the soft chorus of life. Laughter, footsteps, the hiss of stew, the scrape of a chair. One evening, autumn burning across the sky, the family gathered by the hearth. Sarah sat with her daughter, braiding dark hair into neat plaits while the fire painted their faces in gold and shadow. The boy dozed against the wall, boots dusty, head nodding. Thomas sat opposite, knife in hand, carving a length of wood into shape. He worked slowly, shavings curling at his feet, the quiet scrape of blade against grain steady as breath. No promise was spoken that night. None was needed, for in the silence, in the firelight, in the simple acts of hands that mended, worked, and rested together, a truth had settled. This was no longer a fleeting refuge, no single night against the storm. This was a home rebuilt from ruin, carried by scars, shaped by endurance. The land outside whispered with the first frost of winter. The rocking chair creaked. The rifle gleamed in its place, repaired. And within, beneath the watch of old ghosts and the blessing of new laughter, Thomas Carver and Sarah found what neither had thought to see again.